Are you interested in getting involved in property development? Well, this bonus episode of the Michael Yardney podcast is just for you. And even if you're not interested in property development at the moment, or maybe even in the future, you're going to learn a lot about property selection and what happens in the mind of a successful property developer as Dan Gold interviews my son, Bryce Yardney, in this special bonus episode between the regular Michael Yardney podcast. So welcome to this show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's most trusted property commentator, who has once again been voted our leading expert in wealth creation. That's the fifth time he's won a similar award in the last 7 years.
Amongst the most commonly read blogs on Property Update are how to get started in property development. And clearly more people are interested in property development at the moment, as in general market capital growth isn't so strong, so they're keen to produce their own capital growth, manufacture capital growth. I got involved in property development in the 1980s and I made lots and lots of mistakes, but a rising market carried me through. If you make those mistakes in today's current flatter market, you're going to get yourself into real financial trouble. So I hope you're going to enjoy today's podcast where we talk a bit about property development. Well, I said we, it's actually not even me. My son, Bryce Yardney, who for many years now has run our development arm at Metropole, is interviewed by Dan Gold of Long Property. I enjoyed listening to the interview, so I asked Dan if I could share it with you, and that's what we're about to do. I actually found it interesting, my influence on my son, so you may enjoy hearing a bit about that as well. If you're interested in getting involved in property development, you're going to get a lot out of this show. And if you're not really ready for property development now, just put this in your memory banks, put it in your library, your mental library for the future, because it's the way successful investors manufacture capital growth, get higher rent returns, get better bang for their bucks, and done correctly, it actually, in my mind, minimises risks. But you've got to know what you're doing, and you're going to learn some of those things as Dan Gold interviews Bryce Yardney. I'm off now to listen to the show just like you, so enjoy.
I'm Dan Gold, and today we've got the special guest Bryce Yardney in the office. G'day, Bryce. Welcome.
Hey, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Super pumped for a couple of reasons. Property development is a big topic that so many of our audience want to learn more about. And, we've kind of touched on it throughout the podcast in years past, but this is the first real guest expert that's coming in to shed some wisdom. So
I'm honoured. Appreciate
your time. And then secondly, I think one of the big podcasts that rivals the Long Property Show is your dad's podcast.
Yes.
So it's semi-competition, but at the same time, we've also got like quite a good working relationship, don't we, Long Property and Metropole?
Absolutely.
So
we can all be friends.
We can all be friends, and that's how it's come about. So a lot of people, Bryce, would know Metropole and the work that your father, Michael Yardney, has done to develop the company and his brand. But I mean, is that your origin? Is that how you got into property development?
Well, I think my journey probably started a bit before that. When I was a kid, I remember driving around in the car on the weekends with my dad. He'd always go and have a look at sites and would be spending Saturday mornings driving around suburbs that I had no idea about, looking at development sites. That gave me a taste of it from a very young age. Then I went and did a 4-year project management degree straight out of school at RMIT. Finished that, took a gap year actually because I wasn't really 100% sure what I wanted to do. Decided to go and do a bit of work experience with my dad and then just never left. And I've been there for 7-8 years since then. Started off as just a project manager, working in the development department. Then I moved into the purchasing side of it as well. So looking for sourcing for sites, doing feasibility, doing due diligence, purchasing the site, as well as the project management of the development, and been doing everything for the last 5-6 years and been running the department for the last couple of years as well.
Yeah, very interesting. All right, cool. There's a lot to unpack there. just so I understand, though, I mean, your dad is a guru in this kind of space. Did you grow up kind of talking about all this at the dinner table, and is this in your blood, DNA wise?
Not really. I wouldn't say we talked about it at the dinner table, but I was certainly involved and part of it, and we'd always go out to the properties, even if it was just watering the gardens of his newly finished development so that they'd look pretty before a tenant moved in or something like that. But certainly since I finished school and got into the area, then absolutely been involved.
Okay, cool. Now, so obviously Bryce heads up the property development division of Metropole. Tell us a little bit more about the business and the division before we kind of get into some more detail for the audience on the development specifics.
Sure. So we do development for our clients. We do developments ourselves as well. I've just finished one myself. We're just finishing a couple for my father. But the vast majority of our developments, we've got 40-something on the go at the moment, mostly small-scale developments because that's what the average investor can do, investing somewhere between maybe 2 and 3 million in good blue chip areas with development friendly councils where we're often trying to find an old house past its use by date that is relatively close to land value, knocking it down and building 2-3 townhouses on there. And our clients are in it to hold for the long term, making their money off the capital growth more than the profit of actually doing the development. And then hopefully we're managing it for them at the end and coming back and doing it again. A lot of our clients are repeat clients. A lot of our new clients are referrals from old clients.
Okay, cool. So obviously the Metropole business is a lot larger and does a whole bunch of other things for other people that are existing and or new home buyers and or property developers with respect to the acquisition and wealth management side, accounting and tax and business advisory as well. But so the property development is just one such arm to the bigger business, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
We see ourselves as a one-stop shop for anything related to property investment, and sure, development is a big part, but we have property management, we have a buyer's agency, we have business advisory, wealth advisory. So anything you could want if you're looking to invest in property.
Fantastic. So you've obviously got the tertiary background here as well, but is it fair to say that where you really kind of cut your teeth and learnt this industry properly is really just through growing up the ranks at Metropole and taking on more and more responsibilities over time?
For sure. I'd say at most maybe 10% of what I learned in university I can apply to my job today. It gave me a good grounding. It gave me a good understanding of some aspects of building and project managing, but compared to development management, which is really what we do, it's project management's a very general term. Development management is probably a more appropriate, more specific term for what we do now, and absolutely that's a learn on the job kind of thing.
Cool. All right, so you kind of hit a couple of these points at the beginning, but let's say that I want to do a relatively small scale development, entry level kind of development for a young person in that accumulation phase of their longer term property journey. Where's my head at? Should I be thinking kind of dual lock side by side kind of proposition, and should I be thinking where should I start? What kind of areas should I be focusing my research and attention on?
I think I'll perhaps go back to my journey. It's a good way to explain how other people can start as well. Starting with a development is a big step. It's first of all, it's a lot of money. Second of all, it takes I would say a more seasoned investor, someone that's got the headspace for it, someone that's got the cash flow behind them as well. And I started with an apartment, bought an apartment, added some value to it through a renovation, held on to it for long term. I actually did that twice before I got into a development. And my first development was a joint venture, because even a smaller, just 2-unit development is quite a big price point for someone starting off in property development. So a joint venture is a great way to get in. Half the cost, sure, half the reward as well. But I did a joint venture with my brother. It's great if you've got someone like that, a family member or a really close friend. Getting into a joint venture with someone you don't know has its risks.
Sure.
But if you can mitigate that by doing it with someone you know and trust, then it's a much easier pill to swallow.
And I guess that actually brings up a second point around what the strategy tends to be with these types of assets. Because, for example, let's say you got in with a joint venture partner and you both agree that the strategy here is to buy, develop, sell within a short period of time. That may work, but then you may have a JV partner that agrees should buy, develop, hold, and that could work too. I guess what you don't want is one JV partner to be on one page and the other to be on a totally different one. That can unravel poorly.
Sure. You want to be on the same page going into it. But having said that, once you get to the end, you subdivide, you go your separate ways. One could sell, one could hold.
There could be some flexibility.
And that's the beauty of property. It's a liquid asset. It shouldn't be your plan going in. It's a much riskier prospect saying, I'm going to sell in 2 years. Because imagine if you're someone that bought a year ago and you had to sell in a year's time. You might be in a bit of trouble now. So I think going into it with the strategy of holding is the ideal situation, but it can be solved because sometimes it's not just the market. It's you had an unexpected baby, you lost your job, life gets in the way, things can happen.
Yeah.
So
okay, this is such
once
an
you
important
split,
point.
you can go your own way.
We have to delve into this in a little bit more detail. So is it fair to say that the overarching strategy with the majority of clients that you see through your division at Metropole are in this to buy, develop, and hold, as opposed to buy, develop, sell quickly?
Absolutely.
Talk to that.
Well, going back to the basics, there's 4 ways that you make money in a property development. Number 1 is the profit of doing a development. In the short term, that might be the biggest one. In the long term, it's going to be by far the smallest one. Number 2 is capital growth, which is going to be, as time goes on, by far the biggest one. If you sell at the start, you don't get any of that. You're exposing yourself to the risk of you have to make your money off that first one, off the profit. Otherwise, you're in trouble. You've lost money. Then there's the other benefits of holding it. You'll get a really good rent yield off it because it'll be an artificially high yield as well because you're not going and paying market value for the house, the townhouse, the apartment on the weekend. You're manufacturing it at a developer's cost, which means that you're going to manufacture your own artificially high yield. And then you're going to have some tax benefits in holding it. Maybe some negative gearing if that's how your finance is set up and if depending on which government we have in a few months' time. But certainly some great depreciation in there. For example, on $1 million townhouse, you might see somewhere in the line of $25,000 a year in depreciation, which is probably about half your rent. So great tax benefits in holding onto these for the long term.
Yeah. So the idea there on depreciation is that it exists because you've just newly built this dwelling. Therefore, depreciation benefits high, and it's really just that's a non-cash cost, meaning that your cash flow is not really affected as a result of incurring that depreciation expense, but your tax refund could be quite large because your overall kind of net loss on the property could be magnified.
Absolutely. I think most people are surprised at how low their holding costs are on one of these developments at the end.
Post-development,
Post-development and after tax.
Yeah.
Sure, getting through is the hard bit. You got to have the buffers, you got to have the finance.
Which we'll talk about, yep.
But once you get to the end, it's surprisingly easy to hold on to them. And then you're making your money off... But the main thing you're making your money off will be the capital growth over the long term.
Yeah, and that's another really important point because we know that with real estate investment, in terms of the types of properties that exist for people in terms of their opportunity set, properties they can buy, there tends to be properties that maybe are more growth focused in their positioning, or on the flip side, there are properties that may be more income and yield focused, right? But with this development, it's probably one of the few ways where you can potentially achieve both. If you're buying, a good piece of land in a desirable area, they're the characteristics that support growth. But then if you're kind of adding value to, your dwelling or dwellings on that site, you're potentially getting a high rent too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost getting the best of both worlds. There's no Father Christmas. There's no magic pill that will give you the best of both, but you'll get great capital growth, which is what you should be focusing on, because over time that's what you'll make the most money off. But yes, you'll get a good rent. You'll get a good yield. Most people that can get into a development, have the money to get into a development, probably have pretty good cash flow already. Mm-hmm. So to be cash flow focused, have more cash flow, be more positively geared, pay more tax is not what people are after. They're after the good capital growth, the good growing their asset base while not paying more tax on their income.
And is when you say that that's where the money is and that's what where the biggest kind of potential upside here is that premised on the fact that you're focusing your buying efforts in areas that have shown long-term capital growth outperformance, or is it something to do with the development specifically?
No, the development specifically will only give you that once-off profit.
Yep.
You're buying in good areas that are going to outperform and give you the long-term capital growth.
Well,
that's an absolute fundamental.
Cool. Well, and that kind of leads on to my next question, which is, burning question that actually came in preparation for this. A few people kind of reached out wanting me to ask you specific questions. Very simply, how do you find a good property for development? I guess you'd answer that in a couple of ways, but one fundamentally is going to be, what areas are you focused on? And you're talking about those better quality suburbs. What, in Melbourne, in other cities? How should someone think about that depending on where they're actually located?
Sure. If we're chasing the long-term capital growth, there's really only the two big cities, Melbourne and Sydney, the two powerhouse cities that have had the best capital growth over the last 20, 30 years and will most likely continue to have the greatest capital growth, because that's where the jobs are. That's where the job growth is. That's where the income growth is. That's where the population growth is. They're the factors that are going to keep expanding the difference between those two cities and the rest.
Yeah, and quick plug, actually, just while we're on that, plenty of information on those types of points on propertyupdate.com.au, which is the
Yes.
the website that you and your business maintain. But
yes, thank you.
Yeah, you spend a lot of time kind of producing some excellent research and analytics on that. So encourage the audience to check it out.
Sure. So we want to start with those big powerhouse cities, and then it comes down to the fundamentals of finding any good property investment, looking for strong blue chip areas where people want to live, are always going to want to live, because they're close to where they work, they're close to the city, they're close to public transport, they've got good schools, they've got good parks, they've perhaps got a gentrifying population where the older people are starting to move out and the younger, more affluent people are moving in. But the tricky part of
that's high level, just what makes a good investment grade kind of suburb to invest in. But now we're talking development specifics. What's the extra layer?
The extra layer is you need a development-friendly council to allow you to do the kind of development you want to do. And I would also add to that you don't want to be in a council that's going to allow the kind of development you don't want to be near. Your premium $1.5 million, $2 million townhouses, they're not going to have value added to them by having a big block of apartments next door. You probably don't want that. So it's about marrying up those two concepts of finding the best area for investment and a development-friendly council that's going to allow you to do the kind of development you want to do. And that might mean that...
Let's drill into that a bit further. So development-friendly council, where you can do what you want to do. What specifically should people be looking at in that regard?
It depends what they're going to do. If we're talking about small-scale development, look, a really good test is drive around and see what's happening, see what's being built, what's not being built. Other than that, you need to do some research on councils. There's some great resources on councils' websites. We've been through zoning changes in Melbourne not so long ago. It's pretty unlikely we'll go through it again, but it's worth checking up what kind of zoning you have, what kind of overlays you have, what that council's allowing. Give your council a call, but probably more importantly, speak to someone that is involved in work in that council, a town planner, a project manager, someone that can then give you that insight, because sometimes what you will see on the website and hear over the phone is not the same as what happens in person. You need those...
Or even what you'd see on a billboard.
What you see on a billboard.
Great property, right for development, subject to council approval.
Yeah, subject to council approval is like the word but. Anything that comes before it, it means nothing. So you definitely can't trust it when
But this
it
is
says
where
that.
things can get so confusing for people, isn't it? Because, we're starting to use terminology now that's just not in people's everyday vernacular, right? Different zoning changes and you know, I guess I want to frame this question without just you shamelessly plugging your business and all the kind of professional help that you can provide. But what are the real resources? So you can obviously go to council and speak to a planning department. You could obviously seek out other property developers and see, you know, consult with them for expertise. Are there any other kind of, you know, key websites or resources that you'd recommend?
There's the Victorian Planning website that's pretty good. They've got some great resources there. A good town planner. A lot of people won't know what a town planner is. They're basically someone that's going to help you navigate your way through council, and they'd be able to give you a really good idea of what you can do, what you can't do. And when it comes to councils, it's not always black and white. You're dealing with people. We're dealing with councillors, you're dealing with neighbours.
And there's sometimes a lot of grey, even in the planning guides and
absolutely. There's always regulations and there's always exceptions to the regulations, and someone like that will help you understand those grey areas. And
there are like preferences, but it's not exactly black and white, is it? And then there's, you know, all these other issues that can crop up with respect to people's interpretation of that or objections towards it, which can kind of unravel a whole different sequence of events with complaints and VCAT and
it can get very, very political in some councils, and sometimes it's not a matter of common sense and black and white. It's a matter of somebody appeasing their constituents.
And it's so critical because, you know, people that are going down this path are outlaying substantial amounts of money, and if you get it wrong on acquisition, then, you know, it could be game over on day one. Right?
Absolutely.
You really need to kind of get this right at the beginning if you're going to have any chance for good success.
I have some very uncomfortable conversations with people sometimes that come to me and say, I bought this great development site, I want you to develop it for me. And then I'll have a look at it and say, sorry, mate, I can't help you with this. You know, you've bought yourself a mess and I can't get you out of it. So there's some great value to be had in buying and some big money to be lost in buying the wrong thing as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is, again, a good little flow to the next key question is, what types of financial metrics should people be focused on when they're doing due diligence around the acquisition of a potential development site?
Everything is the short answer. Everything is, firstly, there's the big ones. There's the land cost. And you have to be realistic with that as well. It can't be the cost that you want to pay. It has to be what you will most likely have to pay for this property. Because the more you kid yourself with these numbers, the more you're going to get yourself into trouble. Very easy to change one little number here and there and suddenly you're in a bit of trouble.
And just for clarification on that, I mean, people might be buying a piece of land with an existing dwelling on it, but you're really just focused on that land value because the likelihood is that you're going to just demolish whatever the dwelling is, be left with the land, and then develop on top of that.
Yes. Vast majority of properties in Melbourne will have a old house or a house on there or some kind of dwelling on there. We're looking for something close to land value that no owner-occupier is going to go and fall in love with, or even a fixer-upper that they think that I'll renovate this and extend it. And can't compete with that.
Well, the dwelling is just so kind of almost inhabitable.
Exactly, yeah. So it will be land value in a year.
Yep.
So you want to be paying land value for it now because you don't get any money back for that. You will probably rent it out for a little bit in the meantime because it might take you 6-12 months to get your plans and permits. It might even take you longer than that. So I'd be suggesting to people that you do buy something with a livable, rentable house on there. Yes, it should be close to land value. It shouldn't be uninhabitable. It shouldn't be an absolute dump because you're going to have to spend some time getting your plans and permits, and it's your fallback position as well.
Yeah.
If, like I said before, life gets in the way and for whatever reason you can't go and build this in a year's time when you intended to build it because job, life, babies, something's happened and you can't do it, it's a fallback position to, I've got a livable, rentable house that I'm going to sit on.
But this is good also in the context of the financial metrics that people should be considering, because one of the big kind of financial inputs is going to be, what are the holding costs with respect to getting to a completed development site? And even if what you buy is rentable, the rent is likely to be low because it's majority land value that you've just paid for, and therefore, depending on what level of gearing you've got to make that acquisition, you still could be in a fairly heavy negative cash flow position from the outset, and people need to ensure that they've got the cash flow and or cash available to support that.
Yeah, I would not rely on anything more than 1.5%, maybe 2% maximum yield
in Melbourne.
In Melbourne for these old rundown houses, and probably not much more elsewhere either. Perhaps if you're doing it in some other higher yield cities like Brisbane, you might get a little bit more, but still, it's going to be very low yield, certainly lower than your income's certainly going to be lower than your expenses.
Now, if you're geared at 50%, that may not be a big cash burden, but if you're geared at 80% or thereabouts, then you
absolutely.
But then, to your earlier point, it is often the caliber of client that's got the cash flow that can support it, or at least a savings pool that they can draw from. Keep going.
Yeah. So that's the big one, the land. Then there's the construction, which is really hard if you haven't done it before to know. First of all, you got to know what you're building. Otherwise, you can't put a construction cost on something you don't know. So you got to have an idea of what you're doing, what you can build, and then how much it's going to cost. And we've got the advantage that we can pull from our last 20, 30 projects on similar sites and say, hey, this is what we can roughly build and this is what it's roughly going to cost. Really hard for a first-time investor that doesn't have that team around them to understand
What I see invariably with people doing this is they have a really high-level conversation with a builder around like what would my build cost on a per square meter basis involve, and they just do that simple arithmetic. So many square meters, so much cost per square meter gets you a rough estimate. But I mean, just talk to that for a second. That could be way off.
It absolutely could be way off.
It's likely to be way off.
And I would say that the more inexperienced you are, the more unsure you are, the bigger contingency you have to allow, the bigger risk margin you have to allow, because you've got to assume you're wrong. Yeah, you might want to add 10%, you might want to add 20% to what you think it might be, because that might be what it realistically is.
And then there are so many other variables. I mean, what builder are you talking to? Are you talking to somebody that's just kind of quoting you some low figure just to try and kind of incentivize you to work with them? There's any number of things that could be off.
Absolutely. I wouldn't be talking to just one builder. I'd be talking to a few. Architects can be quite helpful with these. They'll often have a good understanding of what you can do and how much it will cost. A good project manager will be the same. A builder is probably going to be more biased than those two people. So if you can find an unbiased source, that's going to be the way to go.
Yeah. Okay. But again, we're just pulling it back to what kind of financial metrics are relevant here in terms of the feasibility. So what you're talking about are all the different costs involved that you need to get accurate kind of guidance on. But then in terms of the feasibility, what are you actually doing with those costs?
We're adding them all up and then seeing if it's worth it then. So we've got to add up the land, the construction, we've got to chuck stamp duty on there, your interest and your holding costs on there, consultant costs, you've got to pay an architect, an engineer, maybe a project manager, a bunch of other little ones along the way as well, rates and taxes to council along the way. And then there's going to be a whole bunch of other little costs that don't fall into those categories, like, paying Telstra and the NBN and Southeast Water and all these little ones that will add up to $15,000, $20,000 as well. So we need to add all of those up. And then we need to look at the other side of it as well. What money are we going to have coming in? What is it going to be worth at the end? And the only reasonable way to do that in my eyes is say, this is what it is worth today. The end values of what we're going to build, this is what they're worth today. You probably want to apply an escalation rate to them to say, well, it's going to be some capital growth, and that might be dependent on the timing in the market. But I would say if you're planning on getting into an investment that's not going to increase in value, why would you do it? So I think you have to apply some escalation to not only the values, but to the costs as well.
Got it. So you've added up all your costs. You've got some visibility now as to what the end value of the project might look like.
Yep.
end value less the cost is going to give you some kind of profit.
That's your profit.
And is that the number that you're looking at, or is it like the profit as a percentage of the cost base? Like how do you size up a good deal versus an average deal?
Two main things is one is the margin on development costs. That's a really good way to look at it. The other one is internal rate of return, which is looking more at the time aspect of it as well, and that's a good way to compare one investment to another.
Okay, and to ask the obvious question, what kind of return on costs and what kind of internal rate of return, rule of thumb, should people be looking at to ascertain again a good deal versus just a run of the mill one?
I would say a reasonable expectation of margin these days is about 15% margin on your development cost. If you're a beginning investor and you need to add a decent risk margin onto that, you might want to look for something closer to 20%.
Yep. And in terms of the internal rate of return?
10%, usually, give or take. Again, maybe a bit higher if you want to add a risk margin onto that.
And some of our audience are going to have no idea what an internal rate of return is. So
I think you might explain that better than me.
Well, it's really just looking at you put money in at the beginning and throughout the project, and then you've got some end value at the end, and that rate of return is going to basically be a figure which dictates what return that you're making from the beginning to the end of your assessment period, right? Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I agree. And the biggest difference, it's sometimes easy to manipulate the numbers when you take out time for a margin on development costs. You sit on that piece of land for 10 years and you go and build it at the end. Your margin on development cost seems fantastic, right? But it's taken you 10 years to get there.
Yeah.
That's where internal rate of return really comes in and says, you've made a lot of money, but you've also lost a lot of opportunity and you've bled a lot of cash along the way. So it's a more accurate way of understanding what you're getting into and if it's profitable.
Like without stating the obvious, but you can immediately see the complexities involved here with respect to getting all of these numbers correct, which ultimately dictate whether or not you're buying well and you do have good prospects for profitable development, hence really wanting to just engage with experts if you're already not an expert yourself to ensure that you're going about it the right way.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess let's talk about holding costs, because that can be a big one. We touched on it earlier in the context of the holding costs prior to you having plans and permits and then your fixed price building contract and starting the development. But then there's also some pretty hefty holding costs through the period of development. Do you just want to talk to that and what some of the risks around that are?
Sure. For the first year or so while you're going through and getting your plans and permits, your holding costs are going to be for the piece of land you've bought minus whatever bit of income you've got from renting out the house, which probably isn't going to be much. There'll certainly be a gap there. And then it starts to get even harder after that, because you're going to kick that tenant out, you're going to knock the house down, you're not going to get any income anymore, and now you're going to slowly increase your debt as you go through a construction contract.
You're progressively drawing down the construction finance all the way through till completion, which might be, say, a 12-month process start to finish.
Yeah, it might be. And then you get to the very end, you've hit your peak level of debt, your holding costs are higher than ever, but then you start getting your tenant in or perhaps selling it, or getting your two tenants in, you start to get the tax benefits and it becomes really easy to hold.
Yeah. So again, it just means that people need to account for those holding costs before and during development, and you can account for them by what? By having either a large cash flow surplus at the outset, which can absorb that cost, or just money on the side that you can draw from in order to cover it as well.
It used to be much easier. It used to be a case of you could buy a development site, hold it for 5 years, and the increase in value and the lowering of your loan-to-value ratios would mean that you could borrow against that to build it. I mean, you're probably better positioned to answer this than me right now, but my understanding is that you're going to be limited by your serviceability no matter how much the property increases in value. If your income's not increasing, your serviceability is not increasing, you might be stuck with that development site forever, or at least until finance regulations change.
So the big thing that we're doing with our clients there is if we've got a client that comes to us and says that we're looking to go down this development path, then obviously we're not just doing the serviceability on what it's going to cost to acquire the land. We're then just doing part two, which is, do you then have the right level of serviceability to afford the construction finance? And then do you have the financial means to kind of get through the entire construction and see it through to completion, which is where where the money's at. But absolutely, this is a lot more difficult.
I'll give you a bit of a plug here, because I do truly believe it, that you need a good finance broker strategist coming into this that understands development, understands the cash flow requirements of development, because I've seen too many people think that they can get through when they really can't, think that they're going to get a construction loan in 12 months' time when they can't, and suddenly they're stuck with a really negatively geared property that they're never going to be able to develop.
And then thanks for the plug.
No.
But then what inevitably happens there is they may find themselves in a position where they're forced to sell, and that's the number one way that people lose money through developments, when they're selling prematurely and they haven't really done anything.
Yeah, they haven't had any value yet.
Yep.
They might get a bit lucky with some capital growth. They might not.
Yep, very good. All right, so we've touched on a few of these points, Bryce, but maybe just to kind of start wrapping things up, what would be some of the top tips for people that are thinking about going down this path of a substantial renovation, or perhaps even a development project?
Biggest thing for me is, and I do it myself, is surrounding yourself with a good team. There's so many moving parts. There's so many people involved, so many things that can go wrong, so much money that can be spent that doesn't need to be, if you don't have the right team around you. And it's got to be a team of, first of all, starting with perhaps a good real estate agent, perhaps a good network to find you the property, perhaps a good buyer's agent that understands development that can buy you the property. Then it's a good project manager that can lead the development. Or if you're doing it yourself, good architect and town planner to get you a good design that's going to appeal to your market, that's going to have value to it, a town planner to navigate you through the council and deal with neighbours and politics. And then when it gets to the construction, a good builder is invaluable. And I think we've all heard horror stories of builders. So
yeah, the builder goes broke and you're kind of stuck halfway through a project.
The builder takes advantage of you. The builder sticks you with variations for this and that, and suddenly you're paying $100,000 more than you expected. So surrounding yourself with a good team of people you can trust and that will perhaps cost a bit, but perhaps bring you a whole lot more value than what they're costing you is going to help you get through this without any nasty surprises and costs. Yeah,
no, exactly right. We've kind of, hopefully we've kind of fleshed out enough in this quick discussion so that people can kind of see, the importance of doing just that. And then just before we wrap up, what are your thoughts on, let's say that a client is successful in some kind of dual occupancy development. What next? Do they go on to then building 4 and then building 6 or 8? Or, do you see clients that kind of come back for a second and ultimately just replicate the same thing? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think people that are looking to build a portfolio, to build an asset base to grow from, absolutely they'll come back and do 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 developments. Some people want to move on to doing different things.
Wait. 2, 3, 4, 5. Like of the same development,
of the same
or bigger
developments? No, of the same kind of development.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts there around just rather than doing bigger ones, doing more of the same? You learn the craft.
This kind of development is relatively low risk for a relatively good margin. You're building dwellings that are in strong demand. They're going to be in strong demand. We're really building houses. I mean, we can call them developments and townhouses, but they're double garage, 4 bedroom, 2 living area, 300 square meter houses. They're always going to be in strong demand. They're always going to be a good asset sitting in your portfolio.
In what types of municipalities?
If we're talking Melbourne, there's some great areas in Glenara, in Bayside, in Stonington, Whitehorse. Mm-hmm. We prefer to stick to a lot of the suburbs that have done well, the southeastern suburbs, eastern, some of the northern suburbs as well. Mm-hmm. They've done really well, and there's some great councils in amongst there as well.
Yep.
And building your portfolio with really good assets like that is going to serve you well.
Yep, makes sense. So maybe then just to end, probably a key question on many people's lips at the moment, is now a good time to buy and specifically get into these types of development projects?
I think it's one of the best times I've had to buy in a long, long time. Development sites were probably hit the hardest in the last 12 months because of the finance squeeze and developers' inability to get finance. Builders are slowing down. The mum and dad types of investors are certainly slowing down as well. And the value in a development site is the opportunity that comes with it. Otherwise, it's just a crappy old house, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And if people can't take advantage of that opportunity because they don't have the finance to do it, it's suddenly a not so valuable piece of land, which is what we've seen. There's not the competition out there for them. They've come down a lot. But the shining light is that the end products, the townhouses, have continued to do fairly well, which means that the gap between them has gotten a lot more attractive. Land prices have come down. End values have stayed relatively high. So it's making it even easier than it has been in a long time to make these developments stack up. And you're probably going to buy in the next 6 months or so at a better discount on what it perhaps could be than we've seen since maybe 2014, 2015.
And what's the risk of a client that does what you're talking about, but then experiences some further short-term weakness in the markets over the next 6 months? Is that a deal breaker? Is that something that they need to be concerned about or not?
If you're in this for a long-term investment, and which is what I think you should be for the next 10, 20, 30 years, no. That buying at the absolute bottom of the cycle versus, missing out on it by 6 months, it's guesswork. Yeah. It's almost gambling, trying to wait for it to bottom out, and nobody ever gets it right. Buy when you have the ability to do it, you have the money to do it, and the timing seems right. And
yeah,
I think it's going to be a great year.
Because you're at the coalface. You are actually the buyer's agent that is working on behalf of your clients to acquire these sites. What are you actually feeling on the ground in an auction scenario or in some kind of private sale arrangement? I hear some interesting stories from developers who acquire real estate. Yeah. What's the state of play? I mean, you say that there's good buying opportunities. What does that actually mean in practice?
Last year was really quiet in terms of purchasing development sites. And by that, I mean auction numbers were rubbish. There was very few bidders. There was a lot passing in. I think it's starting to pick up. It's still very early to tell. I mean, we're only really starting to get into auctions the last couple of weeks in Melbourne, but it's starting to pick up. Numbers at opens and auctions are better. So I think we're heading for a bit more, at least stability. Yep. Good buying to me means that there's not much competition. I can negotiate with a vendor rather than having to compete against 3 or 4 other bidders at an auction, which is putting me in a much better position to buy the property for a good price.
Yeah, vendors on the back foot, less competition, and all the power to you.
It's a nervous thing buying property.
That could change, right? Like that's the type of thing that may flip on its head in 6 months' time.
For sure. Yeah,
quickly.
We could have a change of government. We could have a change of tax legislation. There's a lot of things that could change
market sentiment. We could have a loosening in credit policy, anything. And then all of a sudden, it only really takes an extra 1 or 2 people that you're competing against for a particular property that could be the difference between you paying an extra 50 grand or not. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. It only takes 2 bidders at an auction to push it up versus 1 where it passes in and you're negotiating with a vendor who's... it's a nervous thing buying a property. It gets the heart pumping and the butterflies going, but imagine it on the other end. Imagine you're the seller and your property's just gone through a 3 or 4 week auction campaign. You've just had the auction, nobody's bid, or you might have got one person bidding. You're devastated and you might be desperate to sell. So that's it might not be a nice thing to say, but it's a great time to buy.
Amazing, Bryce. Well, hey, thanks so much for your time. Super helpful. Does this mean now that we've done this that I can be on the Michael Yardney podcast?
I'll see what I can do.
I think that'd be an unfair skew. I'd get exposure to like 6 gazillion people overnight. So I can't quite reciprocate in the same way with the Long Property Show. But look, it's a good start. We've got plenty of listeners that are very interested in property development and real estate investment in general. Your insights are most appreciated. Can clients kind of reach out to you and get in contact and ask more questions if they have?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Our website, metropole.com.au, or 95918888.
That's
the phone number.
Plug, the phone number at the end. I'll put that though in the notes. Bryce, thanks again for your time. We'll talk again soon.
See you later.
Cheers.
Well, I hope you learned something about property development as Dan Long interviewed Bryce Yardney. If you're interested in finding out more about Metropole's project management services to help you become what we call an armchair developer, we can run the project from concept to completion, and there's some opportunities in Melbourne and some great opportunities in Brisbane at the moment with it. Go to metropole.com.au and leave your details, and we'd love to have a chat with you and explain to you what's involved. I'd also like you to do me a favour and pass the details of this show on to just one other person, because just like I've passed on Dan Gold's show to you, and I hope you got some benefit from it, maybe you can pass on the news about the Michael Yardney podcast and help other people. And I also love it when people leave me reviews, because that gets the message out and helps us rank higher. And I'm going to read out 3 really quick ones today. One from Mark McNamara, who left a review on Apple Podcasts saying, "So much good info. I can't wait for every new episode. So much to learn, but easily explained." Now, remember, if you leave me a review, like Mark McNamara did, and you email me, michael@metropole.com.au, I will gift you one of my books as a way of saying thank you. And I'm also going to say thank you to Katie Smith, who said thank you to me. Thank you, Michael. I was introduced to this podcast by my mother and find the information incredibly valuable. Inspired by Michael, I've decided to take a learning approach in preparing while saving for my first investment and do this in a job that has me in a car a lot. I love being able to listen to the podcast, otherwise it would be lost time. Thank you, Michael, for your dedication and sharing your knowledge and experience. And Katie's in the United States of America. Yeah, it's amazing how this podcast ranks in many, many countries in the world. I'm very excited by how highly it ranks on iTunes, and I can see that we're getting the message across, and I love that. The last review I'd like to quickly read, another 5-star one, is from Julie, who says, "Helpful insights on a lazy Saturday morning. I often listen to your podcast on Saturday mornings and thoroughly enjoy them. Today I tuned into 6 things the financial media won't tell you, and super parents raise super kids." Well, Julie, thank you for listening to the show. And again, if you email me, I'll be more than happy to gift you a book for leaving the nice review that I'm going to continue reading out. michael@metropole.com.au. And Julie continues, "I've got 3 investment properties now." Well done. And although they're essentially doing well, you touched on the fact that unforeseen difficulties may arise. And indeed they have, but unfortunately they're not fortunately, I got it wrong, Julie, they're not insurmountable. So I'll aspire to be an elephant, as you suggest, and carry on. And the interview with Laurie Atlas on Super Kids had several light bulb moments for me that I wished I'd paid more attention to when mine were younger. So thank you for the kind review, and I look forward to getting back to the regular Michael Yardney podcast. They come out every Tuesday on my Property Update website or on your favourite podcast app. Oh, by the way, if you don't subscribe to Property Update, why not do that too? Because on my daily Property Update blog, we have information coming out from all Australia's leading property experts. Look forward to catching up with you real soon.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect and pass on their wealth through strategic property advice. If you got value from today's show, we'd really appreciate it if you would leave a review, and we'll read it out on a future show, and Michael will gift you one of his books as a way of saying thank you. Just go to michaelyardneypodcast.com/review and let us know what you think. If you don't already subscribe, head over to iTunes or your favourite Android app. You'll find us there as Michael Yardney Podcast. If you'd like to gain instant access to the show notes, head across to michaelyardneypodcast.com. Watch out for our show next week. You'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success and money in around 30 minutes.